The morning sun cut through the thin mist of the training ground, painting long, harsh shadows across the frozen turf. The air smelled of damp earth, sweat, and pine resin, and the faint metallic tang of rifles hung in the background like an omen. A group of foreign instructors, hardened veterans of Ranger courses and European Special Forces programs, gathered near the obstacle course, their boots scuffing against gravel, eyes scanning the arrivals with predatory assessment. They were expecting the usual: tall, broad-shouldered operators, muscle and mass, honed into the textbook image of elite soldiers. What they saw instead made the laughter begin before a single drill had started. The Australians stepped forward, their movements precise, yet their frames noticeably smaller, younger, almost deceptively fragile against the bulk of their American and European counterparts. One instructor, his voice laced with sardonic amusement, muttered loud enough for all to hear, "Did they send the real operators, or bring their kids?" A ripple of laughter followed, low and cruel, bouncing across the training field. Whispers spread, glances exchanged, the subtle scoff of professionals convinced they had already claimed superiority. To the observers, this was a joke, a minor distraction before the real training began. To the Australians, it was an insult, a gauntlet thrown not in jest, but as an outright challenge. The initial drills began, and the larger, more heavily muscled candidates lunged through the obstacles with brute strength. Pull-ups, sprints, loaded carries, they executed the motions with textbook efficiency, flexing their perceived advantage in sheer size and power. The Australians, by contrast, moved with a different rhythm: compact, economical, and almost imperceptibly efficient. Fingers and toes found holds the instructors hadn't expected. Shoulders and hips rotated with a fluidity that defied the rigid, mechanical style of their bigger peers. The observers' laughter became nervous chuckles as the Australians, seemingly unremarkable at first glance, began shaving seconds off obstacle times that others struggled to meet. By the third day, the pattern had become undeniable. The so-called kids were surpassing expectations not by brute force, but by a blend of endurance, tactical calculation, and a near-pathological attention to detail. They navigated rope climbs without wasted motion, adapted on the fly to shifting terrain, and exploited every minor mechanical advantage their smaller frames offered. When a weighted stretcher had to be carried over a rocky incline, the Australians moved in near-silent synchronization, leveraging leverage and angles that left the heavier candidates huffing, teeth clenched, muscles screaming. The instructors' earlier condescension now began to crack under the weight of observable results. Notes were taken, murmurs exchanged, and skepticism shifted to astonishment. It wasn't just physical capability that drew attention, it was psychological. Whether larger candidates showed frustration, impatience, or even resignation, the Australians demonstrated an eerie calm, an almost detached focus that seemed immune to fatigue and peer derision alike. One instance, etched into the memory of those present, saw a European candidate collapse halfway up a vertical wall, gasping and shaking, while a diminutive Australian simply recalculated, shifted his hands, and scaled the wall without breaking rhythm. The spectators' laughter faltered, replaced by a stunned silence that spoke volumes. What had been presumed to be vulnerability, a lack of mass, a youthful appearance, was being revealed as deceptive camouflage for resilience and skill. By midweek, course records were falling. Timed runs, obstacle clearances, endurance marches, the Australians consistently outranked larger and longer-trained operators. Instructors began muttering about the anomaly, cross-referencing training logs and previous benchmarks. Tactical exercises that had once assumed raw strength were being rewritten in real time, as it became evident that strategy, agility, and precision could outweigh brute force in critical scenarios. Humiliation, which had initially targeted the Australians, now reflected back onto the observers. Those who had mocked, laughed, and doubted were forced to confront a simple truth: selection criteria, muscle mass, and intimidation factor were insufficient predictors of operational excellence. The final demonstration of the week was an endurance navigation exercise across dense woodland and uneven terrain. Heavy packs, disorienting map coordinates, and simulated enemy contact compounded the challenge. Observers expected attrition among the smaller candidates, anticipating that fatigue would reveal a physical ceiling. Instead, the Australians moved in unison, fluid, and relentless. Their compact frames slipped through brush with minimal noise. Their eyes scanned constantly for threat indicators. Their bria thing remained controlled despite exertion. Within hours, they had reached the objectives with time to spare, leaving heavier and more celebrated operators struggling behind. Notes were scribbled furiously, and whispered recalibrations of doctrine began to circulate among the instructors. By the closing ceremony, what had begun as derision had transformed into grudging respect, though rarely admitted aloud. The instructors' assumptions about size, age, and appearance had been systematically dismantled by efficiency, endurance, and a culture of preparation that emphasized mental fortitude as much as physical ability. The Australians had turned ridicule into a weapon, demonstrating that the true measure of an operator lay not in bulk, but in adaptability, precision, and relentless focus under pressure. Every skeptical smile, every dismissive chuckle had been repaid with quiet, record-breaking performance that would echo in training manuals and influence future multinational operational doctrine. And yet the story that would later circulate among the veterans was not just about victories and records, it was about perception and misjudgment. The instructors had catastrophically misunderstood the Australian ethos, toughness measured not in inches or pounds, but in judgment, ingenuity, and the refusal to be defined by expectation. What seemed like youthful inexperience had been lethal efficiency. What appeared small and inconsequential had been unstoppable persistence. The legend of these operators, seeded in ridicule and forged in action, would ripple far beyond that isolated course, shaping reputations, doctrinal debates, and the way Allied forces evaluated unconventional warfare potential for decades to come. The first step into the world of Australian Special Forces is deceptively quiet. There are no banners, no parades, no heroic fanfare, just a relentless grind, a crucible designed not to break the body alone, but to probe the mind. In the dense bushlands, on the wind-scoured ridges, and across river crossings swollen by rain, the selection process of the SASR and commando units begins. Unlike the more familiar Allied pathways, where bulk, brute force, and the ability to carry impossibly heavy loads define a soldier's potential, the Australian doctrine measures a far more elusive currency: endurance under stress, cognitive acuity in chaos, and the quiet, almost invisible, capacity to persevere when all systems fail. Allied programs often favored physical domination. British and American selections leaned heavily on size, the ability to carry standard loads of 40–50 kilograms for long marches, the confidence instilled by raw muscle. They sought warriors who could impress through appearance, who could intimidate simply by their stature and the power of their stride. By contrast, Australian selectors were seeking operators. They wanted individuals who could move quietly for days through harsh, unforgiving terrain, who could make a critical tactical decision at the edge of exhaustion, who could maintain composure when the supply line was miles away and contact with headquarters was non-existent. Strength mattered, but it was subordinate to mental endurance, situational awareness, and psychological resilience. Australian philosophy was shaped by geography, history, and operational necessity. The vast, rugged expanses of northern Australia, combined with experiences in Malaya, Borneo, and Vietnam, had imprinted a singular truth: small, highly trained teams operating deep behind enemy lines could achieve objectives that larger, conventional units could not. There was no room for reliance on supply convoys, mechanized support, or immediate reinforcement. Long-range patrols were the standard, not the exception. Success depended on an operator's ability to outthink, outlast, and outmaneuver, often in isolation, often with no safety net. This doctrine naturally demanded a radically different set of traits from the candidates who passed through its selection gates. In practice, this meant that Australian selection began with what many outsiders might call paradoxical criteria. Candidates were deliberately tested for endurance rather than raw power. A man who looked small, young, or unassuming could score higher than a naturally large and muscular recruit if he displayed superior cognitive performance under sleep deprivation, heat, and physical stress. He might be required to navigate kilometers of dense jungle with minimal food, making critical navigational choices while fatigue sapped every ounce of physical energy. Observers from allied nations would often express disbelief. The candidate did not look strong enough to survive. But survival in this philosophy was not about size. It was about mental fortitude, adaptability, and the ability to sustain action without support. The selection itself was a study in controlled suffering, designed to expose flaws and reveal hidden potential. Forced marches extended into nights. River crossings required both physical agility and meticulous planning, and psychological tests measured the subtle interplay between stress and judgment. Instructors watched not only how candidates performed, but how they recovered, how they processed setbacks, and how they managed fear. Cognitive endurance became a more valuable metric than the number of push-ups or loaded marches completed. Emotional regulation, the capacity to maintain decision-making clarity when all physiological and environmental systems were failing, was weighted above physical dominance. Here, a small, wiry operator could outperform a larger recruit not because of superior muscle, but because the mind refused to yield when the body protested. The divergence from Allied philosophy became most apparent when contrasting approaches to team integration and operational stress. Allied forces often emphasized hierarchical robustness, larger teams, multiple layers of leadership, and redundancy in both manpower and firepower. The Australian model operated on trust in the individual operator, with small units of 4 to 6 men expected to execute missions with near-total autonomy. This required a selection pipeline that privileged judgment and problem-solving under duress over intimidation or physical presence. It required a recognition that the battlefield would not forgive a lapse in cognition, no matter how imposing the recruit appeared. Perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of this philosophy was the conscious embrace of apparent weakness as a predictor of strength. Candidates who seemed too young, too slight, or too unassuming were often pushed hardest, tested more rigorously, and watched most closely. Instructors understood that these unexpected operators often exhibited qualities that conventional metrics overlooked: ingenuity, patience, quiet persistence, and a refusal to succumb to fear or discomfort. By contrast, those who looked the part of a traditional warrior, tall, broad, heavily muscled, sometimes faltered under the relentless, unglamorous grind of the selection environment. The system, by design, weeded out the physically imposing yet psychologically brittle, leaving a cadre of operators uniquely suited to Australia's operational reality. Sensory detail punctuated every stage of the selection. The sting of salt-laden sweat running into eyes during a tropical march, the abrasive brush of branches scraping against fatigued skin, the distant, disorienting roar of swollen rivers, all became instruments of evaluation. Candidates were monitored for how they adjusted, recalibrated, and pressed on despite discomfort, for how they interacted with teammates in isolation, and how they maintained focus when nourishment and rest were scarce. Each hardship revealed layers of character that would remain hidden in conventional training camps. Endurance was measured not merely by survival, but by effectiveness. Who could act decisively, navigate accurately, and maintain operational purpose when all immediate comforts were stripped away. By the end of the pipeline, the philosophical split between warriors and operators was unmistakable. Australian selections produced men who did not merely fight, they adapted, improvised, and endured. They thrived in the gaps that conventional militaries feared to enter, in environments that crushed those dependent on logistical certainty. The paradox was clear. Those who appeared weakest on the surface often proved the most formidable in practice. The operational reality of small, independent teams operating in isolation had reshaped what it meant to be a soldier. Size, strength, and intimidation were incidental. Endurance, cognition, and psychological resilience were essential. It was a quiet revolution in military selection, one that would define a generation of operators capable of bending the jungle, the desert, and the mountains to their will while allies watched, often bewildered, from the conventional frameworks of war. This philosophy of self-selection, of embracing the counterintuitive, of valuing operator qualities over warrior appearance, would echo across every patrol and mission that followed. It was the foundation of an elite force built not by bulk and firepower, but by the relentless testing of mind, body, and spirit, forging a cadre capable of surviving and thriving where others could not. The rain had stopped, but the mud clung like a second skin, sucking at boots with every step, as if the ground itself wanted to test them. Silence filled the valley, except for the occasional snap of a twig beneath careful footing and the distant murmur of a river swollen from last night's downpour. For the instructors, veterans of decades of jungle, mountain, and desert courses, this was routine. This was the measuring stick, the crucible where physicality, endurance, and mental fortitude met reality. And yet, today, they felt a tremor of disbelief creeping through the ranks of those in khaki and canvas. Australians, teenage, wiry, seemingly untested, were rewriting every assumption they held about performance. Course records had been precise, measured to seconds, meters, and calories expended. Every checkpoint, every live-fire exercise, every ambush scenario had a baseline. Standard operating wisdom held that candidates under 1.8 meters and less than 80 kilograms simply could not sustain navigation speeds, accuracy, or stress response against sleep deprivation over multi-day exercises. And yet, as the first team emerged from the jungle grid, the silence was immediate. Not a cheer, not a murmur, just the quiet, drawn-out recalibration of expectation. "Time, that's impossible," muttered one instructor, pencil frozen above the log sheet. The Australians had navigated the 12-kilometer traverse across broken jungle canopy in less than half the average expected time, and with fewer stops, fewer breaths, and no sign of the strain that normally marked the 0600 checkpoint. Their maps were immaculate, their compass readings flawless, yet their sweat stains were modest, their boots caked but not bogged, their gait economical rather than explosive. It was as if the course itself had been scaled by someone who understood the jungle as more than a terrain, who breathed with it rather than against it. Next came the firing range, a narrow corridor of cracked earthen berms and makeshift shelters. The rules were unforgiving. Sleep-deprived candidates had to hit moving targets at 200 meters, adjust for wind, humidity, and rifle drift, all while monitoring squad positions and reporting radio updates. The expectation had been that physical fatigue would shatter precision, that tremors in smaller hands would betray distance judgment. The Australians surprised even the skeptics. Time after time, they scored above 95% on moving targets, their eyes sharp, breathing controlled, muscles steady. Each shot fell with the precision of someone who had calculated energy expenditure, who had allocated attention like ammunition, conserving it for the moment it mattered most. One veteran instructor whispered, almost to himself, "They're thinking through the exhaustion. They're thinking it all." Ambush scenarios followed, staged along narrow gullies with hidden machine gun emplacements and snipers simulating enemy fire. Traditionally, larger candidates relied on brute force to push through obstacles, lift logs for cover, or drag simulated casualties. The Australians, by contrast, operated on sustainable thresholds. They maneuvered in fluid, low-exertion sequences, rolling, pivoting, and leveraging terrain rather than muscles alone. An instructor recalled the moment clearly. "I watched one kid crawl under that wire with a pack heavier than himself. I expected him to hit the dirt hard, grunt, and waste energy. Nothing. He flowed through it like the jungle was carrying him. I swear I felt the standards shift beneath my pen. Their efficiency wasn't just tactical, it was almost philosophical, a rejection of wasted effort in favor of an energy economy. Interrogation and stress testing pushed the narrative further. Candidates were subjected to simulated capture, sleep denial, disorienting light cycles, and high-pressure questioning designed to break the mind if not the body. Many of the taller, stronger students crumpled under the combination of mental fatigue and physical restraint. The Australians, slight in stature, barely out of adolescence, resisted. They compartmentalized, answered with precise cadence, maintained posture, and did not betray panic. Instructors who had designed the tests were forced to mark results that defied expectation. One declassified memo read, "Candidate Group 3 demonstrates psychological resilience exceeding physical norms, stress markers low, cognitive function sustained, reassess physical dominance assumptions." The room had gone quiet, then tense, then contemplative. Respect had begun to creep in where skepticism had lived. Even small, sensory details marked the turning point. The instructors noticed the way water rolled off their jackets during river crossings, the calm cadence of breathing over puddled ridges, the quiet synchronization in moving through snake-laden undergrowth. There was no strain-induced muttering, no wasted motion, no hesitancy. Where larger candidates had to pause to reset, adjust packs, or catch a breath, the Australians maintained momentum. Their bodies consumed calories sparingly, muscles engaged only when necessary, attention focused entirely on the task. They weren't physically indestructible, they were operationally optimized. One course director would later note, "We train soldiers to be strong. These kids train themselves to be smart about being strong." The friction between old doctrine and observable reality intensified during long-range marches. Traditional metrics had rewarded raw strength, candidates who could carry heavier loads faster, who could push beyond comfort zones on route endurance, but the Australians consistently outpaced heavier peers while carrying lighter packs. Their heart rates were lower, recovery faster, stride more consistent. Biometric readings taken secretly during one exercise revealed a fascinating pattern. While older candidates spiked early and plateaued with exhaustion, the Australians exhibited steady efficiency curves, maintaining output without a collapse in precision or decision-making. They weren't burning themselves out, they were managing performance as a system. The final week of the course brought the combined test: navigation through broken terrain, live-fire precision, simulated ambush, and extraction under stress, all with fewer rest periods than previous iterations. Skepticism had hardened into quiet anticipation. Observers expected chaos. Instead, they watched an elegant orchestration of movement. Energy was allocated to necessity. Decisions were rapid yet measured. Accuracy was maintained under duress. And when the final checkpoint was reached, times posted on the boards stunned even the most battle-hardened instructors. Records broken by margins they hadn't anticipated. Accomplishments that invalidated decades of assumed correlation between size, raw power, and operational effectiveness. In debriefing rooms, the atmosphere was a mixture of awe and cognitive dissonance. A senior officer, flipping through performance charts, leaned back and muttered, I don't understand. They shouldn't have been able to do this. By every metric, they shouldn't." Another, quieter, added, "We've been measuring the wrong things." Veteran instructors exchanged glances. For years, endurance had been quantified in liters of sweat, kilograms moved, or hours awake. What they had witnessed required a new calculus: precision under fatigue, energy-managed exertion, tactical decision-making unaffected by physiological stress, and an innate understanding of terrain as a multiplier rather than an obstacle. And it wasn't just numbers, it was a philosophy expressed through movement. Where larger candidates relied on reserve strength, the Australians distributed effort intelligently, conserving when they could, striking decisively when necessary. Instructors who had once emphasized raw dominance found themselves recalculating the meaning of toughness. One declassified anecdote described the quietest hall of observation. The moment a group of Australians posted navigation times that shouldn't be possible, the silence wasn't just surprise. It was the pause of a system realizing its assumptions were flawed. The tactical implications became clear even in real time. Smaller, lighter, more cognitively aware soldiers could move farther, faster, and more accurately without resupply or collapse. Physical size and brute endurance no longer guaranteed battlefield advantage. Strategic energy management, precise decision-making, and environmental attunement did. The Australians had demonstrated a form of operational superiority that would influence doctrine, not in laboratories or lecture halls, but in the mud, sweat, and quiet terror of the course itself. By the time graduation arrived, the instructors had shifted. Skepticism was gone, admiration remained cautious but real. Debriefs included grudging praise. "They've redefined the boundaries of what a soldier can be," one senior evaluator wrote. Veterans later recounted moments of disbelief, quietly shared in bars and mess halls. The Australian cadets had operated at the limits of efficiency, demonstrating that operational logic could outweigh traditional physical metrics. They hadn't just survived the course, they had remade it, quietly forcing a reconsideration of how endurance, strategy, and human capability were measured. The final revelation lingered in every whispered debrief and worn notebook. Toughness was relative, strength was tactical, and the smallest soldier could impose the largest impact when intelligence, discipline, and environmental attunement were wielded as weapons. Instructors who had trained for decades suddenly faced the unsettling knowledge that everything they had thought immutable, height, weight, brute endurance, was only part of the equation. The Australians had shown that the battlefield favored those who thought, calculated, and moved smarter, not just those who carried the heaviest load or endured the longest. It was a lesson learned in mud, blood, and exhaustion, one that would ripple quietly through training doctrine for decades to come. The joke lasted exactly 3 days. It started the way it always did: quiet laughs, sideways glances, nicknames muttered under breath. The Australians were smaller, leaner, less imposing. In a mixed training cadre drawn from allied units, they looked like endurance runners dropped into a room full of weightlifters. Instructors raised eyebrows. Other candidates measured shoulders, thighs, chest size. Power, everyone assumed, would decide who lasted. Then the environment C. Loosed N. The jungle phase began before dawn, humidity already clinging like wet fabric. The air smelled of rot and green life fighting itself. Every breath felt thick, as if oxygen had weight. Packs were lifted. Straps bit into skin. The first kilometers were flat and deceptively easy, the kind of movement that hides consequences. By midday, the heat casualties started. Big men sweated hard and early. Shirts darkened completely, then stayed that way. Calves cramped, shoulders burned. Water discipline broke down fast, gulps instead of sips, bottles emptied hours before planned halts. Medics moved quietly, efficiently, already knowing this pattern. The Australians just kept moving. Not fast, not loud, but steady. Their pace looked almost lazy until you watched it long enough to realize it never changed. While others surged and collapsed in cycles, they held a line, breathing through noses, steps short, packs riding high and tight. Sweat came, but slower. Water disappeared from bottles at a measured rate, not in panicked drains. This wasn't tough, it was maths. Lower muscle mass demanded fewer calories. Fewer calories meant less water required to process them. Compact frames radiated heat more efficiently, shedding it instead of trapping it under bulk. Over uneven ground, shorter levers meant less torque on joints, fewer micro-injuries compounding into failure. The jungle punished size. It rewarded the economy. By the second night, the reversal was visible. Navigation lanes turned chaotic. Larger candidates overshot checkpoints, cutting through thick growth to make up time, shredding skin and energy. The Australians traced edges instead, reading ground the way trackers did, soil compression, bent grass, insect noise shifting with human presence. They arrived slower but accurate. Accuracy saved hours. Sleep deprivation hit next. Hammocks sagged, boots stayed wet, feet softened, blistered, split. Some candidates woke with tremors, hands shaking from caloric deficit. The Australians ate less and seemed to suffer less, not because they were immune, but because their bodies weren't fighting themselves. Instructors noticed, then they stopped joking. By the desert phase, the lesson sharpened. Heat replaced humidity, but the effect was the same. Long movements under open sky, sun reflecting off stone until vision wavered. Water was rationed brutally. Shade was theoretical. Here mass betrayed again. Big frames burned water like fuel. Sweat ran white with salt. Lips cracked. Urine darkened. Men slowed not from lack of will, but from overheating systems pushed past design limits. The Australians adjusted without ceremony, sleeves down, not up, faces covered, movement timed to terrain shadows no one else bothered to notice, packs stripped of non-essential ounces. Every decision reduced thermal load by fractions that added up over hours. When a navigation leg went wrong and a group stalled in exposed ground, it was an Australian who found the contour line that led to a dry wadi with residual shade. When someone collapsed, it was an Australian who calculated how much water could be spared without killing the group later. The dependency shifted quietly. By the mountain phase, the instructors stopped pretending neutrality. Altitude thinned the air, punishing excess muscle with oxygen debt. Every climb taxed hearts already strained by cumulative fatigue. Knees flared, ankles rolled, packs felt heavier every meter. The Australians climbed like they were built for it, short steps, high cadence, rest pauses measured in breaths, not minutes. They didn't dominate ascents, they survived them cleanly, less lactic buildup, fewer stumbles, fewer injuries that lingered. One night movement sealed it. A mixed element was tasked with a ridgeline approach in darkness, loose shale underfoot, wind cutting hard. Progress slowed to a crawl. Every misstep sent stones clattering into voids that seemed to amplify sound forever. The larger candidates froze, overthinking each movement, muscles tight, balance compromised by pack sway. An Australian moved to the front without asking. He didn't rush. He tested each foothold with the side of his boot, weight transferring smoothly, body low. Others followed his line instinctively. The movement resumed. Silence returned. No one laughed after that. The payoff wasn't applause, it was reliable. Instructors began asking Australians to demonstrate water discipline techniques, to explain route choices, to lead acclimatization movements. The same cadre who'd dismissed them now deferred without comment, writing notes they hadn't planned to write. Behind the scenes, something else shifted. Course leadership noticed completion rates, injury statistics, recovery times. The Australians weren't just finishing, they were finishing intact. Fewer stress fractures, fewer heat evacuations, lower medical intervention across phases, numbers that didn't fit the initial assumptions. No announcement was made, no doctrine rewritten in the spot, but at the end of course brief, a quiet request surfaced: Australian participation in future instructor development, not as students, as contributors. Vindication didn't feel triumphant, it felt inevitable. For the Australians, this wasn't a revelation, it was confirmation. Their training had always assumed environments would be hostile, supply uncertain, bodies finite. They had never trained to overpower terrain, only to outlast it. The cost was always there. Smaller frames carried pain differently. The cold is a bit harder. Injuries, when they came, healed slower. Psychological strain accumulated in silence, without the bravado that larger physiques sometimes hid behind. Efficiency demanded constant restraint. But in places where conditions decided outcomes, restraint became dominance. The environment didn't care about reputation. They cared about balance, economy, and patience. In the jungle, desert, and mountain, the land stripped away illusions and rewarded what remained. By the end, the joke was gone, replaced by something heavier. Respect, yes, but also unease, because what the course revealed wasn't just who survived best. It revealed that the assumptions underpinning strength were negotiable. And that when the world gets harder, lighter sometimes wins. The resistance didn't come from failure, it came after success. In briefing rooms thousands of miles from the jungle, officers nodded along to after-action reports describing Australian patrols doing what others couldn't. Fewer men, less noise, more control, better outcomes. The admiration was real. So were the medals, the quiet requests to attach Australian elements to sensitive missions, the unspoken relief when they showed up. And then the conversation stopped. Because copying what worked would have meant changing who they were. Inside US and UK Special Operations Headquarters, the friction was almost polite at first. A paragraph here, a footnote there, training doctrine memos acknowledging distinctive partner nation methodologies while reaffirming existing selection standards. The language was careful, bureaucratic, designed to recognize excellence without letting it spread. But beneath that language was anxiety. Australian selection didn't just screen for endurance or intelligence. It quietly filtered out something allies still prized: size. The men who passed were often lighter, leaner, younger-looking, bodies optimized for disappearing, not dominating, frames that carried less mass but more miles. That fact landed badly in institutions built on a visual myth. Recruiting imagery mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Posters, commercials, public ceremonies, the muscular silhouette of the elite soldier, broad shoulders, thick arms, imposing stance, had become part of national identity. It reassured taxpayers, it reassured politicians, it reassured commanders who had come up through the same image pipeline. Internal emails captured the concern bluntly. Optics, one officer wrote, public expectation. Another warned that adopting Australian-style selection would confuse the brand. Brand, not battlefield. Equipment added another layer of resistance. Body armor sized for larger frames, packs designed around certain load-bearing assumptions, weapons balanced for men above a particular weight. To admit smaller operators were not only viable, but superior in certain environments would mean acknowledging that billions in procurement had been optimized around an aesthetic, not a requirement. That conversation went nowhere. In closed-door discussions, senior NCOs voiced what wouldn't appear in memos. Redefining selection meant redefining masculinity inside units that treated physical dominance as a proxy for moral authority. The fear wasn't that smaller men couldn't fight. It was that they could, and that this would upend the hierarchy built on who looked the part. An officer who observed Australian training exchanges later described the mood as uneasy admiration. Everyone respected the results. No one wanted to explain them. Leaked testimonies reveal moments where the contradiction became impossible to ignore. Joint exercises where Australian elements consistently outperformed in reconnaissance and evasion, only to be quietly sidelined when selection criteria were discussed afterward. One British officer reportedly joked, half seriously, "We'd have to fire half our posters." The suppression wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Australian methods were labeled context-specific. Their success is attributed to terrain, culture, luck, or unique national characteristics. Anything that avoided the obvious conclusion that the system producing these men was doing something fundamentally different and better for certain wars. Meanwhile, Allied units continued to select for bulk, power, and visible toughness. Training pipelines rewarded men who could carry the heaviest loads the fastest, even when operational reports showed that weight incurred ease detection, fatigue, and long-term injury. Knees blew out, backs degraded, operators aged out early. The cost was absorbed as normal attrition. One U.S. operator, speaking years later, recalled watching an Australian patrol prepare for a mission. No flexing, no bravado, just quiet adjustments, taped gear, minimal loadouts. They didn't look like us, he said. They looked like locals who happened to be armed. He paused before adding, that scared some people. Because it suggested the war had changed faster than the institutions fighting it. Doctrine committees met. Studies were commissioned. Recommendations were softened until they were unrecognizable. The Australians remained admired exceptions, invited, praised, but never replicated. Their selection criteria stayed quarantined, treated like a cultural artifact rather than a transferable system. This was the core of the dissonance. Allied forces wanted the results without the discomfort, the outcomes without the introspection. They celebrated the operators but rejected the process that created them. It was safer to believe excellence was innate, not engineered. The psychological cost showed up quietly. Younger, lighter candidates self-selected out, assuming they didn't fit the mold. Units lost potential operators before selection even began. Those who stayed learned quickly that looking elite mattered almost as much as being elite. And so the myth reinforced itself. By the time some institutions began revisiting these debates, years later, the wars that demanded such adaptation were already winding down. Lessons were archived. PowerPoint slides gathered dust. The Australian example remained a footnote, cited often, adopted never. The irony is that no one ever accused Australian operators of being less lethal. No one doubted their courage or competence. The resistance wasn't about effectiveness. It was about identity. Changing selection would have meant admitting that decades of assumptions about strength, about appearance, about what an elite soldier should look like were incomplete at best. That was a harder fight than any patrol. So the Allies chose comfort over evolution. They kept the physiques, they kept the imagery, they kept the gear, and in doing so, they quietly accepted a gap between what they admired and what they were willing to become. The battlefield had already delivered its verdict. The institutions just weren't ready to read it. They noticed it before a word was spoken, at briefings, on flight lines, in coalition command tents heavy with coffee and confidence. A flicker of surprise, sometimes amusement when the Australians stepped forward, too young, too relaxed, faces that didn't match the mythology of elite warfighters everyone thought they recognized. The mistake was silent, but it was consistent, and once it landed, it never fully went away. Being underestimated doesn't bruise you once. It grinds you down over time. Veterans later described it as a low-grade pressure that never lifted. Every insertion felt like a test you didn't sign up for. Every patrol was proof you had to earn again. Coalition partners would question planning assumptions, ask for confirmation twice, offer unsolicited guidance. Not avert hostility, worse. Polite doubt. The kind that forces you to decide whether to ignore it or overcompensate for it. Most chose the latter. They pushed harder, moved faster, took on more risk than doctrine required, not recklessly but deliberately, a compulsion to erase skepticism through performance, to make excellence undeniable. Psychological assessments years later began to connect the dots. Chronic capability dismissal creates a distinct stress pattern, not fear-based, identity-based. A constant internal audit running alongside the mission, are we good enough yet? In coalition operations, the isolation sharpened. Other units bonded quickly around shared reputations. The Australians often stood slightly apart, not by choice, but by assumption. Youthful appearance fed the narrative. Clean-shaven faces, lean frames built for endurance rather than intimidation. They didn't look like the stories people told about special forces, so they were treated like an anomaly until proven otherwise. That proof usually came under pressure, a movement through terrain no one else wanted, a surveillance task others deemed impossible, a patrol that returned early with answers instead of excuses. Respect followed, but it was always conditional, reset at the next rotation, the next headquarters, the next new set of eyes. Over time, that conditional respect became corrosive. Operators internalized it. Imposter syndrome took root not because they lacked skill, but because validation was always external and temporary. One veteran described it bluntly: "You never felt done, you just felt not caught on yet." Rest became uncomfortable. Downtime felt undeserved. If you weren't actively proving something, you were failing. The darker side emerged quietly. Ohm pushed past sustainable limits, skipped recovery, volunteered for risks they didn't need to take, not for glory, but to silence the doubt, both theirs and everyone else's. The body kept score, stress fractures ignored, sleep deprivation normalized, emotional compression mistaken for professionalism. In medical notes, patterns appeared: elevated cortisol levels, burnout masked as discipline, anxiety presenting as hypercontrol. Institutionally, the signals were mixed. Australia celebrated the results. Commendations highlighted effectiveness, adaptability, quiet competence, but the subtext remained unaddressed. The mental health burden of constantly having to overprove was invisible in metrics designed to track casualties and mission success. No checkbox for chronic dismissal. No debrief question that asked how it felt to be doubted by allies you were risking your life beside. Psychologists later noted a paradox. These operators often struggled more with post-deployment adjustment, not because they failed, but because they succeeded under skepticism. They returned home wired for validation through action, dropped back into a system that finally acknowledged their competence, and then expected them to slow down, to rest on reputation. But reputation had never been enough before. Why would it be now? The selection philosophy prized youth for good reasons: adaptability, endurance, cognitive flexibility, but it carried an unintended consequence. When young-looking soldiers are repeatedly sent into environments where age is equated with inexperience, they absorb that judgment. Even excellence doesn't erase it, it just postpones it. The message becomes internal: capability is never assumed, it must always be demonstrated. That mindset wins battles, it also breaks people. There's a moment described in one account after a joint operation went flawlessly. The Australian element executed exactly as planned. The coalition commander nodded, said "good job," and moved on. No debrief questions, no curiosity, just acceptance. Finally, the operator writing about it didn't feel relieved. He felt empty. The proof landed, and it still wasn't enough. This is the cost that doesn't show up in after-action reports. Being underestimated doesn't make you weaker, it makes you relentless. And relentlessness, sustained too long, becomes self-destructive. The institution benefited from operators who refused to rely on assumed competence, but it failed to recognize the psychological tax of never being allowed to. The moral question lingers: is a selection and employment philosophy ethical if it creates soldiers who feel they can never stop proving themselves? If rest feels like failure and doubt becomes fuel, militaries need people who can perform under skepticism. They also need systems that eventually say, "You are trusted now, you don't have to keep bleeding to earn it." Looking young was never just about appearance, it was about perception, and perception, repeated often enough, reshapes identity. These soldiers delivered excellence again and again, quietly, professionally, but inside, many carried the weight of a question that was never fully resolved. When is enough enough? The surprise never really went away, it just learned to keep quiet. Even now, at modern selection courses hidden behind layers of classification and polite euphemism, instructors still feel it. That moment of doubt when the candidate in front of them doesn't look like the warrior archetype they grew up admiring. Not broad, not imposing, young, almost unfinished. The kind of face that once triggered jokes, eye rolls, the same old line whispered in different accents for decades. They brought kids. What's changed is what happens next. Across U.S. Special Operations, Tier 1 units, and European Commando forces, selection is shifting, but never loudly, never officially. The pull-up numbers still matter. The rucks are still heavy. But beneath the surface, something more decisive is being measured now. Cognitive endurance, decision-making under depletion, efficiency of movement over raw output. How fast a candidate adapts when the plan collapses for the third time in a day. The Australian influence is there, even when no one says the word. In modern courses, candidates are pushed into prolonged uncertainty. Sleep is fragmented, nutrition is limited, instructions are deliberately incomplete, problems arrive layered, contradictory, unfair, not because war is cruel, but because modern war is confusing. Drones overhead mean movement must be deliberate. Extended reconnaissance means calories matter more than muscle mass. Multi-domain operations punish hesitation more than weakness. The candidate who looks strong but burns hot begins to fade. The one who looks unremarkable but moves economically keeps going. This wasn't accidental. Australian selection always favored sustainability over spectacle. The doctrine assumed isolation, long duration, minimal support. That assumption NCE seemed parochial, even backward. Today it reads like prophecy. In a battlefield saturated with sensors, being big isn't intimidating, it's detectable. Being fast isn't enough, you have to last. Modern instructors see it now in the data they don't publish. Smaller candidates maintain cognitive clarity longer under load. They make fewer navigation errors when exhausted. They conserve energy instinctively. When decision-making exercises are stacked at the end of endurance events, the results are stark. Strength peaks early, judgment doesn't. The contrast exposes a quiet truth. The old warrior image was built for visibility, for shock, for intimidation, for moments of decisive contact. But the next wars don't reward presence. They reward absence. They reward the ability to exist inside the enemy's battle space without triggering alarms, to move through contested terrain not as a force, but as a problem the enemy can't solve. Australian units trained for this long, before drones forced everyone else to adapt. Institutionally, this shift is awkward. Militaries are conservative cultures. Selection is identity. Changing what you select for means admitting you misunderstood the problem. So the evolution happens sideways. New evaluation blocks, revised scoring rubrics, more emphasis on peer assessment, more weight given to how candidates think, not how they pose. The instructors notice something else too. Candidates who don't fit the archetype are often underestimated by their peers. They get fewer leadership opportunities early, less attention, and when the pressure peaks, when navigation fails, when timelines collapse, when fatigue erodes civility, they emerge. Calm, decisive, unbothered by the lack of validation. This was always the Australian edge. Comfort with being overlooked, with operating without recognition, with carrying responsibility quietly. The drone era made that mindset decisive. Modern operations require long periods of restraint punctuated by moments of violence that must be perfectly timed. A single mistake lights up the sky. A single unnecessary movement invites precision fires. In that environment, sustainable performance beats explosive effort every time. Candidates who look like they belong in recruitment posters struggle with that restraint. Those who never expected to be admired adapt faster. Their identity isn't tied to appearance, it's tied to the outcome. There is a human cost to this effectiveness. Modern selection doesn't break bodies as often as it breaks assumptions. Candidates confront the realization that strength alone won't carry them, that intimidation doesn't work on sensors, that confidence without clarity is noise. Those who pass internalize a different self-image, less heroic, more functional, less visible, more dangerous. The irony sharpens when instructors compare notes internationally. Europeans refining cognitive stress tests. Americans extend decision-making evaluations deeper into fatigue cycles. Quiet acknowledgements during exchanges that yes, the Australians were onto something early, that youth wasn't a liability, those small signatures weren't a weakness, that endurance of mind outlasted endurance of muscle. The old jokes fade, replaced by something closer to respect. And still, the image repeats. In the Australian bush, candidates move under heat that presses like a weight. Faces streaked with dirt, eyes focused but unremarkable. They don't look fearsome. They don't need to. They move efficiently, speak little, and think constantly. Instructors watch for the same markers they always have. Who navigates clean when hungry, who makes decisions without drama, who carries the team without announcing it. The kids are still there, still underestimated, still outperforming. The full circle moment is not that others now copy the method. It's that modern warfare finally demands it. The battlefield stripped away aesthetics and left only function. The archetype collapsed under sensors and algorithms and logistics fragility. What remained was performance, sustained, quiet, lethal. Combat effectiveness was never about looking the part. It was about enduring conditions that punish ego and reward restraint, about thinking clearly when the body wants to quit, about operating alone without needing to be seen. The instructors know now. They don't laugh when the Australians arrive. They watch closely, because if Australians bring kids, those kids are probably the most dangerous people in the room.